If you know me in the community, you know that I am very outspoken against the Generation 9 metagame when it comes to Draft League. I think there are a lot of big mistakes we have made in tiering over the course of this generation. I think a lot of Pokemon are allowed that realistically shouldn't be, and it's led to some unfun gameplay. So in today's video, I'm going to be going through what I did for this season of the John Jr. Draft League, where I got basically full control over the entire tier list and was able to make any of the decisions I wanted to. We're going to talk about my draft board philosophy. We're going to talk about the team that I got as I'm preparing, and then touch a little bit on some of the Pokemon that my teammates got and the teams that they are bringing. If you are excited for today's video, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and every subscription helps along that journey. But let's get right into it. Let's talk about the draft board. As I said, we are banning basically like 12 Pokemon here, and I'm not going to cover every single one individually, but I wanted to broadly talk about the philosophy that I had going into this season for the draft board. So you'll see here, looking at the 18 and 17 pointers, you're going to see some Pokemon that you see pretty consistently nowadays. Garchomp, Great Tusk, Iron Bundle, Tornti, Terapagos is up in 18, which is definitely new in this season. And then some Pokemon that are familiar in 17, like Latios, Meowscarada, Roaring Moon, Gouging Fire, Enamorus, and then Goldango is up in 17 points. Maybe a little bit high for that Pokemon, but I think I was very, very high on this Pokemon in comparison to what else was in 16, but realistically, that could go down. And if you're looking at here, you'll recognize that there are so many Pokemon missing that you normally see in Draft League. You know, looking at stuff like Deoxys, Speed, and Dragapult just not on the board. Spectrier, usually in 17 points, interestingly enough, just completely gone. Even stuff like Chi-Yu have been removed. I've even banned in 16-point Sneasler, which is, you know, maybe a little bit outside of what you would expect, but this was my philosophy going into this season, is I had a lot of problems with certain Pokemon in Gen 9. If you think about Gen 9 as a metagame and how it's been played, a lot of it feels like, one of the terms I'll borrow from Magic is two ships passing in the night, in that both players have kind of a very offensive game plan that's difficult to interact with, and whoever can engage that plan first usually ends up winning the game. And that's kind of where I felt that this kind of metagame and Draft League format has gone for the most part. A lot of the counterplay has been very, very difficult to maintain. So what I've done is removed a lot of the Pokemon, and I'm going to cover a few of them. I have a notepad here that I'm going to bring up that I think I put them all into. I should have them. I guess I don't. I guess I deleted that. Give me 1 second. I have it in Discord. All right, perfect. I found my ban list that I had here. So a lot of the Pokemon are pretty standard in terms of bans currently. You know, stuff like Chien-Pao has obviously been banned for a while. Stuff like Dialga Origin, out in other leagues. Look, we're not going to talk about that. I had to bring that up once. But like stuff like Dragapult, Deoxys Speed, Darkrai is banned. You know, that's one that's been allowed a lot more recently. I think a lot of my problems with that Pokemon specifically comes from the fact that you can 50% Mickey someone with Hypnosis. I just don't like this Pokemon as a concept at all. And one of the things that I'm really stressing in this tier list is that we don't do complex bans. So you'll see Blaziken is not actually on the tier list. Mega Blaziken, or not Mega Blaziken, Speed Boost Blaziken generally seems to have been fine in recent metagames. Dude, there's a low tier league running with Blaziken Speed Boost. Look, once again, I'm not going to harp on other leagues too much in this, but one of the things that I want to kind of hold myself to is no complex bans. And while I think that Pokemon might be fine, I think the counterplay to it is very limited in a lower power board. So I would like to run a league first before we bring Speed Boost Blaziken into the metagame as an example. And that's where Sneasler ban comes in. I think Dire Claw is a very, very problematic move. I know the argument is always to run Dire Claw. I just don't think that's a good enough and compelling reason for me to allow a Pokemon. I think that one of the problems with Pokemon like Dragapult and Deoxys Speed is linear prep. And I think forcing to run Covert Cloak to prevent Dire Claw is just too linear of prep. Basically simplifies the terms of engagement way too much and makes games kind of basically the same. You know, if I'm thinking about, you know, what's really fun about Draft League is people being creative, coming to unique solutions to various problems. Pokemon like Sneasler simplify games too much, and you know it just ends up being, I have a Pokemon that can switch in, usually a Psychic type, with Covert Cloak that can be defensive, and then that's my answer to Sneasler. Then it just ends up getting worn down by U-turn anyway, but that's besides the point. So I'm banning Sneasler kind of at a principle on kind of the complex ban idea. And that's my main philosophy and main kind of step away from norm is complex bans are just not a thing in terms of, when I'm building this tier list. So Blaziken Speed Boost is not allowed, but that means we're banning all of Blaziken. So you can't even have regular Blaziken at this point. Other Pokemon that are banned that are maybe not typically banned, Iron Valiant is a Pokemon that I think is kind of very, very problematic in terms of what it does offensively. I think just the variety of sets that it has, it's just too much. And I think a lot of people get hung up on the booster setup set, and that kind of lowers its impact throughout the game. I think it can be multi-choice too. All 3 choice items are very, very powerful on it. It puts a lot of pressure, and I think it's virtually impossible to prep for the majority of teams on the board. So this Pokemon, I think, has got to go as well, and I think it's really pushing it in terms of a lot of the leagues that allow it right now. I banned, so the next kind of set of bans, Ursula the Blood Moon I banned as well. I think that Pokemon is super egregious as well. We just had a really good week against it actually in the BBR where Calm Mind Screamtail just packed it up. But I think that's another Pokemon that it requires very, very unique prep to beat it, and a lot of teams just don't have the tools to beat it. I was very fortunate in BBR to have Iron Hands and Screamtail to deal with it, but that's not something that a lot of people are going to have access to. And then Chi-Yu is another Pokemon. I think the gameplay around Chi-Yu is super boring in a similar way to Sneasler. In a kind of a different way, and that Sneasler simplifies everything to be Covert Cloak, just like resist. Everything to Chi-Yu just requires Assault Vest or like very specific prep points, and then it just gets picked off by Ruination and then attack eventually. So a Pokemon that I think probably could be allowed, but I think the gameplay patterns with Chi-Yu are just super frustrating and just super unexciting. The next kind of tier of Pokemon that are banned are the Urshifus, and I think these are banned specifically because of the fact that there's no Terra. I think Urshifu Single Strike without Terra and without a plethora of Fairy types makes it very difficult to actually play against. If we allowed Terra, I would reconsider adding it, just because it gives teams a lot better ways to actually prep against that Pokemon. Without Terra, I think it's maybe a little step too far to include in this type of league. And then Rapid Strike, I think is a Pokemon we actually should have allowed, and I think looking at this tier list, it could use another Pokemon like an Urshifu Rapid Strike in terms of power level. I think that Pokemon's really, really borderline in terms of can it be allowed, and I think I was probably over hastily in banning it. A lot of the philosophies that this tier list comes from is the idea of an early Gen 9 draft, Pokemon were banned that were broken with Terra, and everything had the opportunity on the board to Terra. And that's pretty close to what I've gone for here. Now, obviously, stuff like Terrapagos would be banned if everything could Terra, but that's where mainly the philosophy of this idea of banning everything comes from, are those initial tier lists where we ban anything that was broken with Terra, and you could select any Pokemon on the board to be your Terra captain. The only other Pokemon that was banned that maybe could be allowed was Palafin. I think Palafin's very, very powerful, and it's a very good skill testing Pokemon. I think the counterplay to that Pokemon is also boring, but I think maybe a little bit hasty to ban that Pokemon as well. So I would maybe consider adding Palafin and Urshifu Rapid Strike back to this board. Urshifu Rapid Strike certainly, but Palafin maybe a little less certain on that one. But otherwise, that's what I banned. A lot of it is just, I think a lot of the Pokemon are just too powerful. They simplify gameplay to the point where I think they're not very exciting and fun to play with. And as such, I think this is going to be a much better version of the Generation 9 metagame. Other things that I've done to the tier list, I think everything else should be pretty standard. Petron is very, very high here. I think a lot of people gave a lot of criticism to this movement here. This is something that's kind of really been a BBR position in terms of it being tiered that high. It's low tier in P4G as an example. It's kind of the very much opposite take on that Pokemon. This probably could exist in the 14s, but I think it's very much at the top of this 14 tier, and a lot of teams still drafted this Pokemon, 3 out of the 4 teams, so very much a Pokemon that I still think belongs in this 14-15 range, certainly. Other things that I did, I think everything else is kind of standard. The one thing that I did, which kind of, the fact that it was drafted only once further solidifies this, as I put kind of the weather setters a little bit lower. I really made them a lot cheaper. So Alolan Ninetales, I think, was like 12, 13 points before. I have this Pokemon in 10 points, and only one team drafted it. I think it was our team. Actually, someone on our team drafted it with, I think, like an Annihilate team. We'll get into that in a minute. But I think like a lot of these weather setters are just super underwhelming. If I look here, Ninetales is in 8 points. I think Ninetales is probably better than Torkoal. to be honest, you'll see here that if you look at the Sunsetters, 4 of them, they were drafted once in each team. 3 of them drafted Torkoal, 1 of them drafted Ninetales. So only 1 Sun team per team in the Civil War here. But I put, Torkoal to 10, and it could honestly maybe even be lower, and Ninetales be even lower as well. And one of the main things I did was I put Politoed in 6, and no one ended up drafting it still. People were very kind of apprehensive to the idea of this being this cheap, and it still wasn't drafted. And I think just weather teams in general are just very, very overhyped in Gen 9, and I think putting cheap weather cores to be available to be drafted, I think creates for more interesting drafting dynamics, but certainly not something that many other people agreed on, as I certainly didn't draft that Pokemon at all. I think looking at the rest of it, nothing else really sticks out to me in terms of the draft board philosophy. A lot of it comes down to, I think, banning a lot of the top tier Pokemon solves a lot of the problems that this metagame has, and that I think these Pokemon are a much more interesting set of Pokemon to build and prep around. One of the things, I'm a boomer at heart when it comes to Pokemon, and having a higher turn count, to me, what that means is a lot more decision points in battle, in play, and in the team builder, which I think leads to a higher skill ceiling and a higher skill floor, and a lot more interesting games to watch and play. So that's kind of a broad philosophy of why I banned things and what we're going for. It's just bringing the power level of Gen 9 back to more in line with ORAS and Usum. Certainly more in line with ORAS is how this board would feel. Without Z-moves or in terrestrialization, Usum does feel a little bit more powerful in that sense. So let's get into my team. We'll go to the Team Stardock. I had, in theory, the 4th pick. That didn't actually matter because we just built our teams. And this is the team that I got. I got Terapagos, Greninja, Raging Bolt, Screamtail, Ogerpon, Landorus Therian, Arcanine, Registeel, and Spiritomb. So 2 Pokemon here are on my BBR team in Screamtail and Registeel. I love Screamtail. I think Screamtail is one of the best fairy types in this generation. I think a lot of people give it criticism for being very, very passive. I think, my week 1 battle certainly was not a very passive Screamtail, very, very offensive. In the end, I mean, its primary goal was being defensive, but it has the win con potential. And then Registeel, I think, is just a decent steel type that sets up South Rocks. But I really wanted to try Terapagos. Terapagos is a Pokemon that I hadn't had the opportunity to use up to this point. People, and the reason I drafted it, a lot of people said they wanted this Pokemon gone in terms of the ban list. A lot of people are really thinking this Pokemon might be ban worthy. Doing this tier list stream and doing the OG Albina perfect meta tier list, a lot of people are pretty high on, are kind of over Terapagos. So I want to make sure I use that before we ever did anything with this Pokemon. Do I think that's a threat anytime realistically soon? No, but I think this Pokemon's super cool. I definitely wanted an opportunity to use it beforehand. The rest of the team is kind of interesting. I have Greninja, Raging Bolt, which I think are really, really powerful offensively. John and I actually both have Terapagos, Greninja, and Lando, funnily enough. But I think Greninja does a good job being a really aggressive spiker on this team. We also have Ogerpon, which can set up spikes. So we have a lot of hazards on this team to enable our Terapagos, which is super crucial on this team. Raging Bolt comes back from BBR Season 7, the season to forget, if you will. I want to give this Pokemon another try. I think I gave it a pretty bad go of it in BBR, so really excited to give this Pokemon another try in this season. Just very, very powerful offensive Pokemon with very key priority, and it's a good setup sweeper. We have a lot of good setup in this team between Terapagos, Battlebond, Greninja, and Raging Bolt. Ogerpon actually also can be a good setup Pokemon with the Swords Dance as well, but this Pokemon really covers up really good speed tier in the 110 range, and is just one of the better leads, honestly, that you can have access to between Spike's U-turn and the very, very powerful Stab Ivy Cudgel, and amongst other things, being a setup sweeper as well. So I helped Jason prep against him with an Ogerpon when he was in D-League, and that's where I kind of really got turned on to this Pokemon being very, very powerful in this metagame. Landorus T is a Pokemon that I think has gotten a lot of hate in this generation, and for good reason. There's a lot of tools that it just doesn't have anymore, but I think as an intimidator, as like an electric immunity, as a ground immunity, a lot of good things going for it still. And I think it's lost a lot of the tools, but it's still really up there in terms of one of the best defensive Pokemon that you can draft in this generation. Arcanine is a fairy resist that I just needed to have on this team to enable stuff like the Greninja and the Raging Bolt, and Arcanine's a really, really good fairy resist, and that gives good priority with E-Speed as well. Kind of a mid Pokemon Will it come that often? I'm not really sure, but it kind of helps patch up potentially a fairy weakness that was building on my team. Registeel does that as well too, just being a really reliable stealth rocker. And we get a ghost type. I've been kind of turned on to the idea of ghost types in this generation. Now we don't have a lot of fighting types. Now we banned quite a few of them. But I really want to try Spiritomb. I think one player on our team ended up getting Drifblim. That was another Pokemon on my kind of ghost, team, draft list that I want to try. Mischievous had good luck for us in BBR Scramble draft tournament, or whatever that was called. So we're gonna try Spiritomb this time. I think this team is good. Obviously, I didn't really go too much in depth with it, but this is what we have, just kind of so what you'll see over the course of the next couple of weeks. But let's get into some of the other teams that we ended up drafting. I'm gonna turn off my webcam for a second. So you're gonna see here, this is Armenia's team. We got a really good Great Tusk Lottie Volcarona team. This is a really common core when you look at like DPL and DCL teams. This is kind of Great Tusk, Ground Resist, Volcarona, or Iron Moth kind of core. Very powerful here. And then they've kind of gone through and added stuff like Clodsire to really add to the spike stacking aspect. Add that aspect to this team. Very powerful team here. One that I think is actually going to be one of our potential better teams because of this initial core up top. There's another team I really like here. I really like Eden's team. This team is very powerful and one of my potential favorite teams actually that we put together. I think I would have a lot of fun using this team. Meowscarada Landorus is kind of the core that I have right now in BBR, and this team is just very much use momentum to enable stuff like the Landorus, like the Meowscarada, to get up a lot of damage and a lot of hazards. And then Manaphy is just like a mid-ground bulky water is like a third option on this team. Super powerful. Really love this Pokemon on this team specifically. I think this Pokemon's kind of gets overshadowed a little bit in Generation 9, but certainly on this type of team where you're very momentum based, able to get up a lot of entry hazards, able to force a lot of different and variety prep with Meowscarada, Lando, and Fernape, even Metagross to an extent. Really love this team and how this team can go out and play. We have a Bax team here. I've not been personally a big fan of Bax a lot in Generation 9. I had a really bad experience with it in GBU. I'm super gassed it up as being something that could be ban worthy. Hey, look, was it a little bit of clickbait? Who's to say? But I think this team does a lot better job of enabling it with the Torn and the Slowking Galar. I think Chili Reception and the Bax is going to be super powerful on this team. And then you have a lot of other just good stuff. You have Double Spin here, which is something that's interesting. I'm very much not a big spinner fan. Obviously, we have Terapagos as our only spinner on my team. That's one of the things that we had to kind of grapple with in terms of this process, is building our teams that all sharing a draft board. Is a lot of people have a lot of different perspectives on the metagame. Luckily for me, we had a lot of people who wanted double spin. I think spin is not really that relevant at all in Generation 9, so a lot of that kind of ended up balancing out in the end. But overall, I really like this top 3 on this team, and I think this is a great way to enable Bax Caliber, and then stuff like Rotom, Heat, and Heracross are going to really punish those steel types that want to wall Bax Caliber. I think Heracross is a super fire Pokemon. Super excited to see this team. This team, very good core up top as well. Garchomp, Enam, Cinderace is a really powerful top 3. And then Rotom Wash and Scizor and Quillfish is just really good ways to bring this together with Sinistra. So really interesting team there. I like this one as well. Over here, this is, I don't know if it's one of our weaker teams, but one of the things I have concerns with this team is maybe it's a little bit on the slow side with their speed coming from something like Rabombi. But this Goldango, Kyurem, Slowking kind of top core, I think is really interesting. I think Kyurem's a really powerful Pokemon, and getting a Chili Reception user with that Pokemon is super powerful. Glimmora also gives it a really good lead to enable hazards for stuff like Goldango and Kyurem. So I think overall, one of the things I don't like about this team is maybe the speed a little bit, but I think the bulky offense, the bulky offense core on this team is going to be a lot better enabled in this type of metagame where a lot of the more powerful Pokemon are gone. And it's going to be a little bit of a slower metagame. I also like Beartic. Beartic's a Pokemon that I use in our VGC league that I did earlier this year, and I'm super big fan of that Pokemon. Move the webcam again for Bope's team. Bope has a real kind of an interesting team. This feels like a John Jr. team right here. We got Iron Boulder, we got Zapdos, Samurott, This Pokemon team, and this is kind of where I was thinking like Urshifu Rapid Strike should probably come back, is that this team kind of misses that #1 option. It's got a lot of really powerful Pokemon on it, but missing something like an Urshifu Rapid Strike that can just take over the game. But I really like the defensive core between Zapdos and Pecharon, and I think the Samurott does a good job enabling hazards for stuff like the Keldeo and the Iron Boulder that probably are going to rely on hazards a lot more than other Pokemon to actually get damage done and get some kills in this team. Move to the one of the other teams here. We have Latios, Weavile, Quackavole is kind of a pretty standard offensive core here. I think Quackavole as a third option is very, very powerful, especially with Weavile and Latios being setup threats. Being one of those kind of third Pokemon you have to deal with really enables Quackavole to actually kind of do its thing in this tier and just sweep through teams. Other than that, I think this team is interesting. Skarmory, a Pokemon I did a video on leading into Generation 9. Really sad that this Pokemon does not have Defog anymore. But overall, I think kind of the offensive top 4 of this team is very, very overwhelming to deal with. And we have, actually really decent kind of defensive ways to pivot around this team between the Rotom and the Sylveon Baton Pass, and then some good hazard setting and Ghosts in Dusknoir. Go to Roaring Moon team here. This team is where the only Alolan Ninetales drafted, and this actually didn't even end up being a snow team, interestingly enough. But Alolan Ninetales Veil with stuff like Annihilate, Roaring Moon is going to be super, super powerful. This team is also one of my favorite teams I think that we put together. It'll be interesting to see how Roaring Moon fares in this type of season. I'm curious to see how people leverage this Pokemon being one of the more powerful Pokemon. It has been very criticized in a lot of the Terra metagames that we've played, and a lot of the metagames where we've had a lot of more broken Pokemon. We'll see how it does as a #1 option in this season, but I actually really like the Ninetales Aurora Veil into Annihilate game plan here. Really enables that Rage Fist well. And then a lot of the glue on this team is very good. Gliscor on this team is a really, really great Pokemon to set up spikes. This team really benefits from spikes. Stuff like Roaring Moon, Iron Moth, and Annihilate are really going to love those spikes, especially Thundurus, as a very, very bulky-ish offensive threat. So Gliscor is going to be a great addition to the team there. The only thing I don't like about this team is a little bit of an Ice Resist, but that gives you an excuse to get your Alolan Ninetales in and get that Aurora Veil up. So kind of about that. Into our final few teams now. I really like this team that we built for Star. Iron Bundle, Iron Treads, Ogerpon, Hearthflame is kind of a pretty standard core that you see in a lot of team tours. And the defense around it is just super powerful. Weezing Galar, Slowbro, and Hydreigon to a certain extent can operate defensively as a ground resist. Really kind of helps bring this team together. And this team does a really good job of enabling both Iron Bundle and Ogerpon. Iron Treads is a really, really reliable hazard remover, and you have the Weezing Galar for secondary hazard removal as well. Something that, as I said, I'm not a big on hazard removal in Gen 9, but Ogerpon Hearthflame teams really need hazard removal to enable this Pokemon efficiently, and I think this team does a good job of that. Also really important to enable that with Iron Bundle as well, because you don't want to be forced to run boots on that Pokemon every week. So I really do like this team for enabling that, and then I think Thundurus and Zapdos Galar provide kind of some secondary threats that are super powerful on this team as well. Into the second to last team, this is our Sand team. We have Sand as kind of a complementary offensive core to this Iron Hands, Ogerpon, Wellspring, and Necrozma team, and this team is really, really powerful. I think that Sand kind of fits really well on this team. One of the things that I think this team might still struggle with is breaking grass types. Looking at it, grass types, we can take advantage of them with the Fezandipity, but one of the things that you like to complement with your Sand teams is grass breakers, and that might be something that we have to look at maybe a little bit. But overall, I really like the look of this team. I think grass types, even anywhere, are not really that popular outside of stuff like the Rillaboom, so maybe a little bit of a concern that doesn't exactly exist within reality. Like if we look at the teams that we drafted, there's not really many grass types at all that are actually really good. You see Decidueye is one, Ogerpon is one. That Pokemon does not want to take a lot of hits though. Shaman, Sinistra, so there's quite a few of them, but certainly not as popular of a type as it used to be in this deck. So maybe a little bit of a weakness, but one that certainly I think is overcome by the lack of grass types in this decks, and I think will be overpowered anyway by stuff like Iron Hands and the Necrozma, as well as Fezandipity. And then this is our Sun team. Every team really ended up with kind of one of these Sun teams with Gouging Fire, Walking Wake, a lot of the Sun teams just end up kind of, going to this kind of duo core and then using a Sun Center like Torkoal, for example. And then this team kind of complements it well. I really like the Rillaboom on this team to add a Water Breaker to enable your Gouging Fire and Walking Wake to spam their moves more effectively. And then Sandy Shocks is a good kind of third Sun Abuser kind of option to break those waters as well. And it can break fire types as well, which is super important to enable your Gouging Fire. Obviously Wake can help break through those, but obviously having multiple options to do that is super important. And then we have stuff like Primarina, which is just a really good fire resist of your own, so you don't have to use Gouging Fire as a fire resist against teams that might have a really powerful something like an Ogerpon Heartflame. So you don't have to rely on your Gouging Fire taking a lot of damage. Not that it will from Ogerpon Heartflame by any means, but I think a good water resist to have, or good fire resist to have on this type of team without risking your top tier Pokemon. So there we go. That was kind of a lot of waffle about these teams. I didn't really get too in depth with them. I didn't want this video to be like ridiculously long or anything. But that is JJDL Season number 4, Civil War format. I'm not sure what I'm going to do for content week to week for this league just yet. I think my game specifically, I'm going to do a end of regular season and then a playoffs video once we get there. Because we're making playoffs, and an individual playoffs too. We don't even have to worry about that. But we'll see what we do content week to week. I'll probably do streams covering some of our team's big games week to week. But other than that, there will be an end of regular season kind of massive movie video where I watch through all 9 of my games. And then a playoff one when we make playoffs. So that is a video. Let me know what you guys think of the tier list down below. Let me know what you think of my team and our teams in general in this season. And let me know if you're excited for the JJDL. I haven't done one of these kind of JJDL, OGDL kind of leagues in the past, and it's it's going to be super awesome to get to meet a lot of new people. I think I have only played one person on my schedule before. I didn't get into my schedule in this video because as I said, I don't know a lot of the people in this league, so that's a really awesome thing about this as well. I get to meet a lot of new people. So that's it for today's video. We'll see you guys next time, and as always, have a wonderful day.